everyone. Thank you for joining the Pamunkey Regional Library. I am Kate. I am the branch manager of the Mechanicsville Branch Library of the system. And tonight we are super fortunate to have Sadeqa Johnson with us. So Miss Johnson, welcome. Sadeqa is doing the grand tour for her latest book, Yellow Wife. If you have not read it, please get yourself on that holds list because it is amazing. And there we go. So let's first introduce Sadeqa. So first, who are you, right? So we know you're the author of this fantastic book, but as per your bio, you're a former published relations manager who spent several years working with well-known authors known such as J.K. Rowling, B.B. Moore Campbell, Amy Tan, Bishop T.D. Jakes, before becoming an author yourself. Your debut novel, Love in a Carry-On Bag, was the recipient of the 2013 Willis Wheatley Award for Best Fiction, the USA Best Book Award, and the USA Best Book Award for African American Fiction. So your next book, Second House from the Corner, which we do actually have here in the library. So second book was held by Essence Magazine and a Go On Girl Book Club selection for 2017. And then there was me, so we have that one too, won the National Book Club Conference Fiction Book of the Year Award and was a finalist for the Phyllis Wheatley Award. She has also received the Black Pearl Magazine Author of the Year Award for 2017. Whew! So that's one thing I wanted to highlight because as we were talking before we went on air, Yellow Wife is not your first book.
It is not my first rodeo, but a lot of people don't know that.
So what got you started on this rodeo? So, we just read that you were a former public relations manager and now you're a published author. So where are we at here? What was building block one for you?
So it all started with my love for libraries. I was the girl who got dressed up every Monday. I had a library card to the Philadelphia Library. Mine was the Logan branch, and I kept my card in this very special little printed purse. I walked to the library every Monday. I checked out 7 books. I read a book a day, and then I went back the next week and I did the exact same thing. So for me, it started seeped in a love for reading. I went on to go to college in New York City, and I was a theater major. In fact, I thought that I was only going to be in college for maybe 2 or 3 weeks and that I was going to be discovered and I would be on Broadway, or Bill Cosby would discover me and I would be on the Cosby Show. Yep. 1 or 2 things was going to happen, but I was not there to get a degree. Well, I did get a degree and ended up needing to find a job because my dad said, listen, kid, at some point I'm going to stop putting money in your bank account. And so you're going to have to fend for yourself. I know. So I said, well, what do I love? I love books. And so I decided that I was going to get a job in publishing. And my first job was at Scholastic Books, where I worked as a publicity assistant. As you mentioned, I worked with J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, and Ruby Bridges, the woman who integrated schools in New Orleans in the 60s. And, I had all of these wonderful experiences with these wonderful children authors, but I was constantly surrounded by books. And I got the nugget in my head that I could probably do what they were doing because I was reading them constantly. And so I started penning my first novel. It never saw the light of day, but that got me started from my second novel. I changed jobs. I went from children's publishing to adult publishing, and I ended up at G.P. Putnam Sons. And there I was working with major heavy hitters, major New York Times like Nevada Barr and Catherine Coulter and Amy Tan. And I just used that time with them. Back then it was pre-COVID. And so we were in town cars with them, going to the Today Show and Good Morning America. And I would pick their brains. What's your writing schedule like? How did you get started? How did you get an agent? Where do you get ideas? How do you outline your stories? So I was picking their brains. And as I was doing that, I was also penning my first novel, Love in a Carry-On Bag. And at the time I lived in New Jersey. So I would take the train into New York City every day, and I would write every morning on the train. And then every day at 4 o'clock, I would close my office door, pretend like I was working on something really, really important, because I was,
You
but
were.
it wasn't work related. And so I would type in everything that I wrote on the train. And then I would have to run over to the shared printer, because we had those ginormous printers that we shared between 17 different people,
Yep.
and snatch my story up before anybody knew. And then I would get on the train and I would read what I wrote for that day. And then I would just do the same thing over and over and over again. And so that was the beginning for me writing my first novel. It happened just kind of in transition. And that book took me over 10 years to write. So if there are any budding authors out there who have been nursing manuscripts and looking at the page and wanting to quit and picking it back up, that was me. I was that same girl. And so I would say, just don't quit. Take that manuscript out, give it 10 minutes a day, and just keep on working it, because that's where I started.
And that's the interesting thing. Like, you worked in an environment where you had all of these connections, all of these resources, right? And like you said, your first book took you 10 years to write. And then also, you weren't an overnight success with getting your book published. So why don't you tell the readers what choices you had to make your dream come true?
Yes, there were no easy choices on my road. And like you said, even though I had the background and I had the connections, I finished Love in a Carry-On Bag. I got married and I was having my first child. And so I told my husband, I said, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to have our kid, and I'm going to have this New York Times best-selling book hit the shelves, and everything is going to be great. Well, I got married. I had the kid. The agent that I had, who was amazingly connected, could not sell my first book. And so I was distraught. I was left with the decision of, I could wait 6 months to see if we can go back out again, or I could take my husband's suggestion, which was we should start our own publishing company. And that, that was a scary thing for me. But he said, look at how much experience you have pulled together from working in publishing.
Right.
Let's use what you know, and let's get this book out, because this was the early 2000s and self-publishing was just starting to kind of take shape.
And I don't know if necessarily our readers and patrons know what it means to sell your book. So let's backtrack a little bit, because you have an agent, you've given them your manuscript, right? So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by your agent wasn't able to sell your book?
So what the agent does is she takes the book. She has a list of editors who she thinks will be right for this book. The publishing house will then purchase your book, and then they publish it. So she took it to 10 different agents, and they sent me beautiful rejection letters. Nobody was interested.
They said, great job, but no.
but we are not the place for her. Good luck.
Good luck.
And so that's what happened to me. So I had to come up with a way to get the book out myself. So I wore a lot of hats in that first book. I was the sales manager. So I would call up bookstores and pretend to be someone else. My maiden name is Murray, and my friends call me Dee. So I would call up, the little bookshop in Midlothian and say, hey, this is Dee Murray calling from 12th Street Press. I got this great book, Love in a Carry-On Bag. Can I send you a couple of copies? And that's what I did. I kept up that steady flow. We traveled up and down the East Coast. I went to every book festival I could find. I remember being at the Harlem Book Festival, and it was like 99 degrees. Standing outside, New York City stinks. It was July. I was begging people to buy my book. But on that day, I sold 82 copies. And so I knew that I was on to something. I just had to keep going.
And that's where I think people lose the connection. Like, an author doesn't sign a contract and instantly make $50,000 to $100,000 a year for that book, right? There are a lot of steps, and there are a lot of people you rely on as an author to get your book published. So now that you did your own publishing house, got your book out on the ground, did you then self-publish your next 2 books, or what was that process?
So my editor, who I hired to work on Love in a Carry-On Bag, she was in the process of trying to find me another agent. And so we were still hitting brick walls. She was going after this agent and that agent. And finally, I said to her, Cherise, no one cares about my work the way you do. why don't you become my agent and we can get this book sold? And I caught her right at the moment where she was just starting to think that she might want to be an agent. And so she said yes. We merged with another agent, Wendy Sherman, and we took this book back to market again. Again, we went to 10, 11 different editors. But this time, because selling my book to a big publishing house was always the dream. For me, self-publishing is great to get your story out there, but it wasn't something that I thought I could sustain. So this time when we went to the publishing house, we had 3 editors who was interested in buying my second book, Second House from the Corner. And I actually went with St. Martin's Press because they wanted 2 books. And so I was able to sell Second House from the Corner and Then There Was Me in a 2-book publishing deal.
So how did you know you would have enough material to write 2 more books as you were signing that contract?
Well, luckily, Second House from the Corner was already written. But And Then There Was Me was just an inkling of an idea. And I think I'm a really good salesperson because I didn't really have that much of a story. But when I was in that meeting and it was do or die, the words just started flying out of my mouth and I sold a book that I had not written.
It's kind of like when you're back in school and you're saying, write a 10-page paper. You're like, okay, I'll do that.
That's right.
Now, Yellow Wife came out of nowhere for you. I mean, your previous 3 books are basically, they're contemporary fiction. So Yellow Wife is historical fiction through and through. Tell everybody, because this was an epiphany moment for you. And I hope that you continue on this path, but the way that you came about this story is just beautiful. And it really, I think, reflects on you as a person because it's so family oriented.
Well, I was standing in my kitchen. At the time, I was living in Springfield, New Jersey, and I was standing in my kitchen. It was February 2015. And I remember standing at the counter and looking out of the window because I was always thinking a couple of things. Where are my kids going to go to school? How are we going to pay these taxes? Where are my kids going to go to school? How are we going to pay these taxes? And I heard a voice that said, you should move. And it wasn't like move down the street. It was like move. And I listened to that voice because it was so strong. So 2 weeks later, we were in Central Virginia meeting with a realtor looking for a home. By June of that year, we had purchased my home and we moved in. And there was no static. There was no friction. Everything just fell into place. It was easy. So I knew that I was in alignment with what I was supposed to do. I just couldn't figure out why it was what I was supposed to do. But I said, I'm just going to trust it. And so 9 months later, April of 2016, I had some friends from New Jersey who came down to visit. It was their spring break and they had 2 kids. We have 3 kids. And they said, let's do something that we can get outside and show the kids around. Someone suggested that we take a walk along the Richmond slave trail. I had not ever done it, hadn't done anything kind of touristy, historical in Richmond too much at that point. And so we said we would take a try. So we drive down to the Manchester docks, we park the car, and we're walking along the James River. And for those who have not been to the Richmond Slave Trail, it was unveiled in 2011 with 17 different markers. And it gives the story of what it was like for the enslaved people as they came into Richmond. Richmond was number 2 in the slave trading industry behind New Orleans, which was number 1. So this place is steeped in history. So we're walking along the trail. The kids are taking turns reading the markers. And we get to a marker that talks about the Lumpkins Jail. And it is described as a holding center and punishing site for enslaved people. The owner of the jail, Robert Lumpkin, is referred to as the bully. He's also called the devil because this is the devil's half acre. And what it said was that he had a flair for cruelty. So if there was a nearby planter that wanted to make an example of his enslaved person, he would then send them to Robert Lumpkin to be punished. What caught my attention was the marker said that he was married to a Black woman and her name was Mary Lumpkin. And together they had 5 children. And I just couldn't stop wondering what life was like for Mary Lumpkin. We know women like her did not have agency over their lives. So my question was this a marriage of survival? Did she love him? And what did she tell those 5 children every day? Because if I could just paint the picture of this half acre of land, we have the jail, which was said to be one of the smelliest places because they never cleaned it. They crammed these enslaved people in like chickens in a coop. And so it was just hot and smelly and dank. And then there was the tavern, which also dubbed as a hotel. And this is where Robert Lumpkins did his business. There were the kitchen house and other small outhouses. And then there was the residence in which she raised their children. So these kids were faced with these situations and these circumstances and these families being separated and people being beaten on a daily basis. And I just couldn't stop wondering what was life like for Mary Lumpkin and what was life like for her children. And so while I'm having these thoughts, I could feel this energy around me that says, Sadeqa, pay attention. And I was in between books at the time. And so I knew it was kind of like those tentacles that come from my writer's brain. My children get tired. They're like, okay, enough of this. Let's go home. And I'm like, wait.
As children do.
Yes. I was like, I need to see the site of the Lumpkins Jail. So we get in the car, even though it's a short distance, they're like done with this whole thing. So we get in a car, we drive to the spot where the Lumpkins Jail used to be. And I'm standing there and I could feel this energy. And so we walk under the bridge to the sacred African burial ground. And that is where, during that time, when the enslaved people died, there was no ceremony for them. And so they literally waited for the bodies to pile up and then shoved them in the ground. And we're walking on this land. And as we're walking, the friend who I'm with, he says, don't you feel that? And he starts to pretend like he's playing the African drums. And the kids start stretching their bodies like they're African dancing. And it's like, wow, this feels like a celebration. It feels like a coming home. It felt like the ancestors were waiting for us. But then I had the thought, I think the ancestors are waiting for me. They want me to tell their story.
No, I'm getting chills, right?
And that was so scary and so invigorating all at the same time.
That's a huge, like I said, I got chills when you said that. That's a huge responsibility to take on, to acknowledge that you might be the one who can really give that story some life, bring it to recognition. What did you do then? So you're not a contemporary, you're a contemporary writer, so you're not a historical fiction writer. How did you go about switching gears? Because when you write contemporary fiction, there's not a lot of research involved. It's your brain and creativity, your life.
Yeah, when you're writing about yourself, which is very common for me to throw myself in the story.
So what did you do? Now I have to admit, and those who work with me and those who know me know, I was late to jump on the bandwagon for this book. And I'll tell you why. Because of the title. Okay? Now, most of the time, you don't hear a mixed race person being referred to as yellow, right? So let's go into your research a little bit, and then you can kind of tell readers where this came from.
Absolutely. Yes. So I went home and I became obsessed with the story of Mary Lumpkin, the Lumpkins Jail, and Robert Lumpkin. So I'm just Googling and I'm just trying to get more information about them. And it's to the point where I'm pretty obsessed. But I don't feel qualified to write this story because how in the world am I meant to write a book that took place over 100 years before I was born? But I had a friend who came to the house and she asked me what I was working on. And I'm telling her and I'm like, but I am so afraid. And she said, the thing that scares you most is what you're supposed to be working on next. And that opened the door and said, Sadeqa, just give it a try. So I grabbed my daughters. I made them my research assistants. We headed down to the Shirley Plantation in Charles City, Virginia. So that was the very first plantation that we visited and we walked the land. I'm one of those authors that need to smell it, feel it, taste it, touch it. I needed to connect with the energy of the
Mhm.
ancestors. And so that is what I did. It was there that I found a slave ledger on the wall in the kitchen house
Mhm.
that had a list of names. And that's where I found Phoebe spelled with a Y. And right away, I knew that that was her name. And Dolores came because in the very first scene, Phoebe's mother calls to her and she calls her Dolores. And I go, oh, she calls her by her middle name. It's her way of claiming her as her own. Because
Mhm.
again, these women had very little that they could claim as their own. So that was Phoebe Dolores. And I took the name Viney Brown from my own family tree, which was Phoebe's great grandmother who came over from Africa on a boat, and her mother knew her story. And so I
Mhm.
thought Phoebe Dolores Brown. And so that's where I got her name. The title of the book came from, I was doing some research and I came across a small portion of Robert Lumpkin's will. And in the will, he said, I leave my fortune and my real estate to my yellow wife. And he was talking about Phoebe Dolores Brown. And then he says, I leave some other things to my black concubine. And in my story, that would be Sissy. I don't know who that person was in Mary
Mhm.
Lumpkin's life, but I created a character named Sissy, and she was the black concubine. And so that's what I did. I went to the Library of Virginia. We're very fortunate that it's just
Yes.
downtown in Richmond.
Mhm.
Got to know my librarians. They helped me find periodicals that took place in Richmond during that time and stories about the Lumpkins Jail. I also read a lot of textbooks. I read slave narratives, which to me were the most,
Mhm.
they were the most, that's where I got a lot of the feeling of what it was like to move in their bodies. And it was important for me to give that to the story. So I read Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, which if you have not read, it is phenomenal. I also read 50 Years a Slave by Charles Ball and
Mhm.
Frederick Douglass's book. And so these were books that helped shape the way they moved in the story and the way they felt and the things that they actually experienced.
Now, what made you decide to change Mary Lumpkin's name for your book?
I wanted to have the freedom to weave fact and fiction. If I had used her actual name, I would have had to stay as close to history as possible. And I did, even though I didn't use her name, I did use
Mhm.
as much history as possible, but I wanted to be able to fold a lot of different histories in. And so I was able to find information on Mary Lumpkin, but then there was Karina Hinton, who was also
Mhm.
married to, she was also a mulatto woman who was married to a jailer in the area. And so I could take bits and pieces of her story and fold it in so that I was telling a complete picture.
And that's one of the great things about historical fiction that I don't think a lot of maybe authors and readers recognize. You can put as little or as much fiction in a historical fiction book as you want. So, you're writing your book based on an event or a place or a specific person, but the fictional element, that is really what enraptures readers. And I have to say, your writing style with this book, it is so expressive, so expressive. And Phoebe as a character is just incredible. You really can feel all of her ups and downs, her emotions, her defiance, and how much of her is you? Let's be honest. How much of her is you?
Out of all four of my novels, I would say that Phoebe is the least like me. I think that she really took on a life of her own. And so I got what I knew about Mary Lumpkins and women like her. But as I got her down on the page, she just started to move and I followed her. I would say where I put myself in the story is when it dealt with her children, because I'm very close to my children and my oldest child is also a boy. And so those heart-wrenching scenes that I had to write with her children, I could put myself in her place and write my feelings. For writing for me is kind of like acting. Acting is my background, and so
Yeah.
I need to throw my whole self in it. I need to feel it. It is not uncommon to find me at my computer crying because of a scene that I'm writing. I get so deep into in this case, 1850. Right now I'm writing about 1940s and 1950s. But yesterday I was in my office and I'm like knee deep in the story, and I'm talking out loud and I'm acting out the parts. And my husband comes into my office and scares the bejesus out of me. And he's like, "You didn't hear me coming?" And I'm like, "Listen, my body is here, but my mind, yes, I'm in the portal. I am somewhere else. Right. So just because you see my body, I am not here."
Now, do you have a different style of writing as, when you're doing fiction or historical fiction? Does your process change? With historical fiction, obviously, there's more research, but do you change how you go about getting words on paper and crafting the story and allowing the characters to come to life to you?
I would say with every novel, I've just gotten a little bit deeper in my process. When I started with my first book, I didn't really know what the heck I was doing. So I just wrote chapter 1. And maybe that's why it took me 10 years. I didn't have an outline. I didn't have any form. I was just kind of writing. I was just going for it. Mm-hmm. And so with each book, I have a really wonderful agent who was an editor before. And so she's kind of taught me how to prep prior to actually writing, so that when I sit down and write, I am ready to go. Mm-hmm. The difference between, say, like And Then There Was Me, which was my last contemporary fiction, versus mm-hmm. Yellow Wife, was that I used a collage wall to help bring me into that 1850s. So I have a wall in my office where I just started clipping pictures of what the jail looked like, what enslaved mm-hmm. people looked like, what the plantation looked like, what I thought Mrs. Delphina looked like, a picture that could be possibly Phoebe and Ruth. And I put those on the wall. And so I would say that process was something that I had not done or needed to do before when I was writing contemporary fiction.
So before we go and talk further about what your plans are for the future, I want to go back a little bit, because there's one part of the book early on where Phoebe's defiance is front and center for everybody. And the way that you wrote it, again, it just touches on how much of a commitment you gave to these characters, so that we feel everything with this book. For those of you who might have the book in front of you while you're sitting here watching us, we're on page 85 and 86. And this is a time, so Phoebe's life has its ups and downs, certainly, and we all know where the end result is. But at this point in the book, she has been taken from her very sheltered way of life and is now being thrown into worlds that she only had stories about. So would you like to read the section? Because I think you know which one I'm talking about.
I know which section you are talking about. So I'll just set it up. So this is when Phoebe, so we all know this is not a spoiler, but this is, we know that Phoebe ends up at the Lumpkins, or right. Now in my story is called the Lumpkins Jail. And so through a series of events, her life completely changes. And this is the beginning of the big change for her, where she finds herself actually on the auction block. And so she has made a friend on her journey, and her name is Matilda. So she's up before Phoebe. So next up, Matilda. She whispered to me that she had hoped to stay with her husband, who was in a group behind ours. Disrobe. Matilda's upper lip trembled, but she gave no resistance. She slid her arms out of her burlap sack dress and let it fall to her knees. She wore nothing underneath. Her hands flew to her full breast to hide the milk that leaked. I turned my head, ashamed by the scene. Face back and squat. When Matilda obeyed, a trickle of blood ran down her thigh. I would like to see her up close, a large man called from the back. Very well, step down and follow the gentleman. Matilda stepped off the platform with her dress still in her hand. She caught my eye before following the man into the side room. My heart sank. She had just lost a baby, reconnected with her husband, and was now being taken advantage of by a stranger for no other reason that it was his right and she had none. Next, the ruddy cheeked man called to me. My dress got snagged on my shoe, and I almost tripped up the step to the top of the block. I wished for something to hold on to, somewhere to rest my hands. The presenter read from his slip. Mulatto girl from Charles City named Phoebe. This here is a house nigger, excellent at sewing and knows how to work the loom. She is prime age for breeding and would also make a fine fancy girl. He made his tone deep and melodic, like he was describing a prized possession. Disrobe, in order that we might see how firm and sound you are. He looked at me. I did not budge. Disrobe now. Wringing my hands, I responded, I will not. The room gasped and murmured while the presenter's cheeks deepened even darker. He looked like a lobster ready to claw my eyes out. Disrobe, wench, or we will have you struck with 100 lashes. Something shifted inside of me. I had never been whipped in my life, but I had been snatched from my home, away from my mama and my truest love, traveled on foot and ropes for days, starved, slept in the equivalent of a hog pen with feces up to my ankles. Nothing else scared me. I would not take off my dress in front of these men. I would not follow Matilda into that back room. I would not sink further into degradation than I already had. They would have to kill me first. And I stood with my feet grounded, preparing to put up a good fight. I plead to be exempt from this exposure. My credentials shall suffice. I stared the presenter square in his pig eyes. He signaled to two armed men standing by the door. Remove her dress now. When they came for me, I braced myself to bite, kick, scream, fight to the death. But before they reached me, a voice called out.
The most magnificent part about your writing style is that you're so descriptive, but yet your book is not 400 pages. Right? So like people think that you need to be wordy to be descriptive. And I think just you reading that segment, I hope that everybody who's listening got the same chills, because just think about that. I mean, as a woman to read that and to know that that's what people went through, I mean, that's heartbreaking. And then to see that she's going to have the defiance in her, despite everything that she's gone through at that point, to say, I don't think so. I mean, that's brilliant. It's brilliant. And I really think it shows your theater background, because that's almost like script writing.
Oh, thank you.
So where are we at for TV rights or movie rights, or is that something you're trying to pursue with this? I mean, and let's face it, the book is only 10 months old. You know, it only published in January of this year, but it's getting, I mean, you're quite the buzz. You know, I don't know. Do you think maybe it's a result of everything that's been going on in society that this book has just hit the mark for so many people because it's the right time? Or do you think maybe it's something else?
I think it's a combination of everything. I think that the book came out in a time when it could be fully aligned with what people were looking for, what people were craving. I think that we have a paradigm shift happening in our country right now, and that people want to know. You know, I speak to so many book clubs, and people just want to know what happened. We don't want to just pretend like slavery didn't happen, or that it's an African-American story. It is our American history. Slavery is what our country has been built on. And when we all take a moment to kind of acknowledge that and say, yes, this happened, you know, this is the result of this, I think it changes our conversation, and it also changes the direction.
I 100% agree with that. And I am a historical fiction junkie. I primarily read historical fiction. So, you know, to come across this book and to really be able to separate it from others and not just lump it into the pile, I mean, that means a lot to me as a reader. So now I'm hoping that you've been stuck by the bee a little bit, because you really show a talent for for historical fiction. So I'm wondering, you said earlier in the conversation you've been in the 1940s and 50s in your head. Do tell. We need a little juice. Tell us what you're working on.
I'll give you a couple of cherries. So right now I am actually coming up on the end of my second draft, which is, oh my goodness. As I say, I have to put so much into it. So like now it's like baby steps to get to the end because it's just so emotionally draining. But I'm writing a story called Where the Bad Girls Go. And hopefully it'll be out in 2023, fingers crossed. But I discovered the story kind of came to me when I was thinking about my grandmother. My grandmother had my mother in the 1950s at the age of 15, and she was unmarried. And what a scandal. Oh, yeah. And my mom says that she didn't know that my grandmother was her mother until she was in third grade, because it was covered up so well, because it was not something that, was proper. It was taboo. Exactly. And so that was kind of the beginning thought of my story. And I was also thinking about women in danger and what that felt like, sexual danger, because there are so many stories of women who this has happened to. And that led me to Homes for Unwed Women. And between 1945 and 1975, over 1.5 million women were sent into homes for unwed mothers, and they were forced to surrender their babies. And so those were kind of the mechanics of the things that I was thinking about. And so this story is written in two voices. And so that's one story. And then I have another story that's kind of happening simultaneously that talks a little bit about what it's like when you marry into a family and you're not wanted, you're not good enough, you're not socioeconomically fit for this family. So it deals with colorism and sexuality and motherhood and socioeconomics, and all of these things kind of weave together to tell what I hope is another beautiful story.
Well, that's a jump. What made you decide to go into a dual point of view type of storyline?
I think I'm to the point where every book I need to challenge myself to go just a little bit further. And I didn't start off writing two characters. I started off writing this one particular character that I spoke about to begin with. But as I was writing, the second character just popped up. And she came to me very desperate, and she was desperate, and I could feel the rage coming off of her skin. And I thought, oh my gosh, who are you?
You need to acknowledge.
I need to pay attention.
Yes.
And so I sat down and I started writing her, and I'm like, how does she fit in this story? And then it was, she needs her own voice. And so I write every other chapter between these two characters. And so, yes, it is a new thing for me. It's a learning experience. I have definitely been pushing myself and growing on this next book. And so I hope it's as well received, or actually, I hope it's more well received than Yellow Wife, because right now Yellow Wife is the very best that I have to offer. And all I can do is just get better from this point.
And I love that you're saying you want to challenge yourself. You don't want to just get into a rut. Yellow Wife was a step for you because it was historical fiction. You're getting great reviews on Yellow Wife. You've gotten star reviews from Publisher Weekly, Kirkus, it's all in Library Journal. People are acknowledging the amount of effort that you put into it. And to say that you're not satisfied, I mean, you're driven. You are driven. And one of the things that I love I do my homework. Okay. So you once mentioned about the amount of times that you rewrite your stories. How has that changed or not changed throughout? Now you're going into your fifth, and everyone just take a moment. She's going to go into her fifth published book. Okay. Are you still keeping with rewriting like you did at the beginning? Or has that maybe been like, oh no, somebody's yelling at me in my head saying, girl, you gotta know, you got better things to do?
It is completely part of my process to retype every draft. And so what I do is I write a draft, and it's like my first draft is kind of like hacking through the woods. And then I print it, I look at it, I make make notes to myself in the margin. I open up a new document on my computer. I put draft 2, and I just retype the whole thing all over again. And what that does for me is it helps me to weed out the things that don't need to be in the story. It helps me to figure out what's missing. It brings me close to those characters again. And so we're reliving, we're visualizing and revising and all of that as it's going through my body. And so I do that every draft until it gets to my agent. Once my agent gets it and she gives me comments kind of in a Word document, then I'm not going to retype it unless it's a scene where it's like, this needs to be rewritten all over again, or this, like if it's something really big or dramatic, I'll take that scene and I'll retype it until I get it right. My earlier books, I retyped a lot more because I was learning how to write. And so it wouldn't get to my agent probably to like the 3rd or 4th draft. Now the books are getting to my agent on like the 2nd or 3rd draft. And so once she has it, now I'm kind of focused on her changes. But when it's just me in the book, I retype it.
Now let's just pause a second. What's an average word count for you?
So Yellow Wife was 83,000 words. And as you said, it's not a 400-page book, but I got it all in there in 83,000 words. I would say today I'm at about 73,000 words into Where the Bad Girls Go. And I know I still have a good 4 chapters left to write. But I think on the next draft, once it gets with my agent and she gives me comments, some of those scenes that might be kind of small because I'm not quite sure where I want to go, she'll give me comments and I'll bring him out a little bit more. And so the novel will grow more on the next draft.
Okay, so for all of our students out there, when you're asked to write a 2,000 word paper, don't go crazy, because
don't freak out.
It's you're not there yet. You're not there yet. But at this point in time, I'd like to just go ahead and invite everyone who's live with us. Any comments or questions that you have, just please go ahead and type them up in the chat. I mean, we've got several people who have commented. Jennifer is commented early on saying you have quite the resume. Laura Hawkins says hello from California. So very pleased to have people cross country here. We've got Mindy chiming in. Mindy Erlach says, I loved Yellow Wife and enjoy listening to Sadeqa. Yellow Wife was one of my favorite books of 2021. And I know Mindy is also another historical fiction junkie like myself. So, and your name is getting shouted out by other members, all of the Bloom. So we didn't talk about this, but you're a member of a writers group. So the Tall Poppies. So what does that meant for you?
It's a community of writers, which the wonderful thing is that we're all supporting each other. My job for the Tall Poppies is I'm the launch coordinator. So I rally the troops every time a new book comes out, and we get ourselves on social media and we promote. So we really look out for each other and try to push books by female fiction writers forward.
And I mean, and Tall Poppies, they're not made up of, no nonsense women here. You've got Heather Webb, you've got Hank Philly Bryan, you've got Amy Runyon, Amy Reichard, and those are just a handful of names, and there are a ton more. So Mindy says, yes, love reading historical fiction and follow the Tall Poppies too. So
yes, I know Mindy's name sounds familiar.
Yeah,
we've definitely interacted a few times.
Her and I make the rounds.
Okay.
But it was so wonderful chatting with you. I hope the buzz for this book doesn't die. And I can't wait to see what else you come up with. I mean, certainly, I think your theatrical background and the art that you have for expression, I mean, it shows in your writing, and that's really what I love about it. So I'm hopeful you keep a little bit of yourself as you challenge yourself and revisit what you want to accomplish as a writer. So we got a few more comments. Your book was at times heart-wrenching and infuriating. Loved it. You did a wonderful job, especially when you described the relationship between Phoebe and her children. And that's with Susan Ayala. Alicia Barnes says, borrowing Yellow Wave right now. Thank you so much for your author talk. And for me and the rest of Mechanicsville Library and Pamunkey Regional Library System, we thank you and we want to have you back. You let me know when that next book is ready to go. We'll do a launch for you and we'll have you maybe in person. Maybe COVID will go away.
Maybe it'll go away.
Maybe it'll go away.
Well, the paperback is coming out at the end of this year in time for January. So keep your eyes open for that.
Definitely go ahead and get those pre-orders in. You never know what the publishing world is going to do in the future. So again, thank you so much for being with us. Everyone who joined us live, thank you so much. The event is being recorded. It will be available for you to view on Facebook, and it will also be posted to our YouTube channel. So I just want to again thank everybody. Thank you, Sadeqa, and good night, everyone.
Good night.